Welcome back. We go into the second session on day 2 of the Asia Economic Dialogue 2023, looking at India's vision for its G20 presidency. Mr. Harshvardhan Shringla, India's chief G20 coordinator, who was originally scheduled to be the speaker, has unfortunately had to cancel due to ill health. We wish him a speedy recovery and welcome Mr. Damu Ravi in his stead. And thank you, Mr. Ravi, for taking up the charge at such short notice. Mr. Ravi is Secretary, Economic Relations, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. Dr. Ajit Ranade, the Vice Chancellor of the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, will chair this session. Welcome, Mr. Ravi and Dr. Ranade. May I please request the both of you to come up to the stage now. I request Dr. Ranade to please start his session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilpa, and good afternoon, everybody. Or I guess it's still good morning. Good morning, everybody. This session is centered around the concept of G20. This is part of the Asia Economic Dialogue Conference, as you know, and G20 is very much contemporary and thematic. And I'm delighted and privileged to be hosting Mr. Damu Ravi, Secretary External Relations, Economic Relations in the Ministry of External Affairs. I am also privileged to say that I have known Mr. Ravi for a long time, and as I like to say lightheartedly, actually he's an economist, but masquerading as a foreign service diplomat in the foreign ministry. So very, very keen student and an expert on many aspects of economic relations. Mr. Ravi, as you know, the first part of this session is a conversation with you on India's perspective on the G20. And we'd like to hear your views and about what the government is thinking. I want to remind the audience that, G20 was formed or founded actually in the wake of the Asian financial crisis of 97. So it was supposed to be a grouping of finance ministers and the central bank governors back in 1999. And even as we speak here today in Pune, the central bank governors and finance ministers are actually getting together in a summit or a huddle in Bangalore in India. As you know, so that meeting is in fact happening. But after 99, by the time we came to the global financial crisis, or more correctly, as many people in India like to think of it as the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2007 or 8, that's when it got elevated to a grouping which now has leaders, heads of states, prime ministers, and so on. So G20 now is a grouping of heads of state. And this year, the presidency has come to India, as you know. And India holds the presidency, and our prime minister is the chairman of G20. So back in 2008, September 15, 2008 was like a mega event because that was the crash of very major investment bank, Lehman Brothers. And after that, in a kind of emergency action, the president of the United States, Mr. George Bush, who was already a lame duck president because by November, the next president had been elected. But he chose to invite leaders of G20. And there was a very famous summit, I think in Philadelphia, if not, or maybe Washington, where the world came together, the G20 countries came together to have as a coordinated and cooperative response to the financial crisis. And indeed, one would say that this was successful because at least the developed countries decided to harmonize their fiscal response. Each country was going to put in fiscal amount of money, and we wanted it to be such that no country should, cannibalize or each other's fiscal response. When a country expands fiscally, that benefit should not go across the borders. I mean, that was the spirit of that cooperation. So both fiscal and monetary policy coordination and cooperation happened, and I think it was successful. And then, of course, later on, 2011, we had the sovereign debt crisis of Europe. But now looking back, Mr. Ravi, if you look back, in 2020, also the world faced a global crisis of the pandemic. And the G20 was expected to have come together for something like a coordinated and cooperative approach. But we saw, especially the rich countries, developed countries, resorting to what I call hoarding of vaccines. The vaccine cooperation, the global cooperation in vaccine distribution, and so on, did not reflect the kind of success G20 had about 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So I want to start off by asking your perspective on this. That what is different about G20, and how do we understand this?
Thank you, Ajit, and good morning to all. Well, that's a very broad sweep of things under the G20 you covered. But let me see how I can
Hold it to the mic.
how I can tackle it. I think if you have to analyze how G20 has evolved, it's important to first understand that the world at some point of time, the G7 countries realized that they alone cannot solve the global crisis, particularly the 21st century crisis that in a way affects all of us around the world. So the G20 then started to have G8 plus 5, and then it evolved into a G20 summit level interaction that you just mentioned. The financial crisis, yes, there was a good cooperation because that was also a need of the time to put the economies on track. I think they did the right thing. When you look at it in a decade's time, how G20 has evolved and how they've been able to handle the global problems, you will see generally the trend has been that in a normal situation, the cooperation seems to be quite active. But in a pandemic kind of crisis, this is again very typical. The nations become very nationalistic in the way they approach crisis. And we've seen this during COVID time that countries started to um, look after themselves first. And that became a priority. But you must also understand there was cooperation, but cooperation of a different kind. For example, in terms of how do you control the spread of the pandemic, the lockdowns around the world, and the countries help each other to um, evacuate their nationals. That was a cooperation on a very large scale. I look at India's response. Even though we were also in need of those medicines and vaccines, but we still shared. So within the G20 member countries, there was the degree of cooperation was there, but within the G20, I don't think there was clear guidelines came out at that point of time. I think the world was simply too overwhelmed by this crisis. But this precisely, that is where we need to plug in. I think the voices of the South, particularly the developing countries, not being adequately represented within G20, you get this kind of gaps in the way G20 sees the global crisis.
In fact, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned. If anything, India's actions actually stand out, and our friends from Brazil also mentioned that actually Brazil also was one of the countries which gave special thanks to India because unlike the Western countries, and we don't need to name them, but there was a concern that the amount of vaccine production in those countries was far in excess of domestic requirements, but there was an element of hoarding. Whereas India ended up doing what is called the vaccine Maitri diplomacy, or sending out vaccination doses to many countries, even though India's own domestic requirement was pretty high. And of course, it also helped the fact that India was a vaccine factory to the world. So you're right. So coming to the point you said about the sort of support between developing countries as part of G20, I am struck by the fact, I want to ask you this question, that G20 consists of one member of G20 is EU. But on top of EU, which is a collection of 27 or 28 countries, you have membership given to Germany, to France, to UK, and Italy. And now you have invited members of Spain and Netherlands. Whereas when it comes to African Union or Africa, which is 54 countries and 1.4 billion people, there's very little representation. So how can don't you see there is something odd about trying to represent is it so glaring that the developing country interests are quite absent from G20 representation?
Thank you, Ajit. I think this question you should directly put to the members of the G20 why
To you.
Africa is not adequately represented. But let me try and bring some reasoning into it as to how it evolved. First, we have to understand that the G20 was the evolution of the G7 and plus one was G8, and then all these member countries were already there in it. So they automatically became members of the G20, and then you had expanded, the emerging economies came in. So today you see seemingly uh, the G20 is heavily represented by developed countries. That's a fact. And you have few emerging economies which are also member countries. But what is the reality is, and we need to understand the gap in the way the decision making is made here. So G20 as a group represents maybe 1/10 of um, the global community. And then a large number of developing countries are not part of it, and a large number
One
of,
tenth only.
yes. So, I mean, we are looking at the UN membership of over 200.
Yes,
So you
yes.
have 20 countries which are actually real members. And then you have the least developed countries not at all in the game. So so someone has to speak for the developing countries. Now, you asked a question about Africa, only South Africa being there, and Africa is 1/4 of the UN membership is actually Africa, 54 countries, which is a large, sizable number, but yet there's only one country representing Africa. I think this issue had come up in several presidencies, but again, you see that AU is in African Union is invariably invited to the G20 presidency in all years during all presidencies. There has been some proposal that perhaps, like AU should also have a permanent role in a membership within G20.
What is India's perspective on that? Will
I
India
think
support an AU membership of G20?
Yeah. So thanks for asking. I think it's very logical that we would definitely support such a proposal coming up, but we must know that these are consensus-based decision making. So even AU's membership to be permanent, it has to be agreed by all the countries. So I
But
think
India is the president, and surely it can drive a consensus on this issue.
well, I think this was debated, this was discussed within the forum. I think somewhere down the line, some view will emerge, but it will not happen overnight. This is a process. And India has always been, as you know, very supportive of the African member countries' voices and their concerns being articulated within G20. And it is recently the Prime Minister held this global summit for the Voices of the South. So, in which you had 45 member countries of Africa represented in that. So, we are articulating a lot of issues concerning African member countries. But again, the issue of who should be in G20 amongst the African countries, I think it should come from the emergence of within Africa. I don't think we can decide which country within Africa should represent G20.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
should be by consensus base. I think they have a very good equation as far as the consensus building for a membership, even in the UN Security Council or even in the G20. We should let that evolve.
So, in fact,
Yeah.
we will come to this aspect of shaping the Global South agenda in a discussion which will just follow this discussion. And our friend from South Africa, she's going to join us, so we'll hear her views as well. I want to dwell a little bit more about India's G20 membership and now this year's presidency. See, G20, and by the way, when you said it only is 1/10 of UN in terms of number of flags, I guess what you mean is number of countries. But surely G20 represents what, 80% of global GDP, maybe 3/4 of the world's population. So, do you think G20 is something we need to invest in terms of a multilateral? Because we are seeing that the other big multilateral, which is WTO, I know that we have a former ambassador sitting here. There is some element of, shall I say, exasperation or things are not working at the WTO level. So should we invest? Is India looking to invest into WTO, into G20 as a potential multilateral for us, where we can put our agenda?
Well, thank you, Ajit. But let me approach that question in a different way. I think today the prominence of G20 and its importance on the global stage is precisely because our multilateral institutions have somewhat failed in delivering. I think that's the reality we have to understand, which is why today the global discourse, which should normally have happened, should be happening in the multilateral institutions, have come out of it, and then it is happening in the G20. That's again a reality we have to understand. So why is this? Why is this dichotomy? It's because the multilateral institutions that were formed were actually much before many countries of today are won freedom and are liberated. So it doesn't reflect the reality of the 21st century. Most of the institutions are still caught up in that age-old guidelines or thinking. So the institutions need to reform, needs to evolve, so it has to be more representative, which is lacking. And that's why today the G20 has taken that space. The discourse of the global issues, particularly the 21st century issues, are being deliberated in the G20. So we have to be mindful of this, but I don't think G20 can forever, hijack the UN systems or the multilateral institutions. But what is happening is today the discussions and the discourse in G20 is somewhat creeping back into the multilateral institutions and then developing the narratives there also. So we need to leverage G20. It's no doubt it's a very influential body. It's the world, 80% of the world GDP, three-fourths of the trade which goes into this among these countries. So it's very important that while we talk about reform of the multilateral institutions, G20 is very important for us to drive that.
So you think
Yeah.
G20 mechanism actually can you be used to strengthen, say, the multilateral institutions like WTO, which need to address, as you said, 21st century issues? And I'll just come to that. But by the way, while we speak about this, even the other Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, are also, I think, trying to reinvent themselves. But of course, in light of crises, the IMF is quite busy. But otherwise, also the amount of capital flows that now go, the private capital flows completely dwarf what capital flows can go through the World Bank and IMF. World Bank, of course, is trying to reinvent in a very major way. We just heard that the new president is going to be an Indian, so we're very happy about it. But about 21st century issues, you mentioned that these new institutions, G20 including, have to be contemporary in terms of addressing 21st century issues. And one of the big issues is climate action or responding to climate change. And there is this issue of climate justice that countries like India, I know this comes up and we'll talk about it because COP29, COP30, India and countries like India are supposed to sacrifice their future to contribute towards climate action. But the countries who are responsible for where we got here, they don't seem to be sacrificing for their past sins. You know what I mean? That we have to sacrifice some amount of future well-being to help climate action, but at the same time, somebody has to pay for past sins as well. So, is this an issue that G20 can take up, the climate justice issue?
Uh, so Ajit, I think I'll revisit your first part of your question first. So whether it's a good thing that the G20 takes on the agenda of the multilateral institutions, I don't think so, because G20 is not truly representing the world community. You have a large number of developing countries, and least developed countries are not there. So how is the narrative being built within G20? Is generally you get a one-sided view that is dominating the discourse in the G20. So you said about climate change, you said about climate justice. Yes, what happens today if since the voices of the developing countries are not adequately represented, somewhat the discourse there gets confused or mixed up. So when you are asking countries to do the emission caps, or you are asking countries to take more commitments on climate change objectives, you actually want to fast track without understanding there are development imperatives for many countries. And it's not that easy unless you address technology issue, unless you get the finance part of it. And you should be understanding that for developing countries to do energy transition is a much more challenging than for developed countries. And we've seen this in recent times, that geopolitical tensions have actually opened up eyes to say that even developed countries are having second thoughts, or how do they progress on the energy transition in the manner that they're expected to do. I think this,
Will India push for consumer? You know, the fact is that the Western countries have to reduce their consumer spending or consumption lifestyles. That is, I think it's becoming very clear. No, I do want to say that climate action is not all about spooking people. There are new business opportunities in the green economy. But one of the requirements, I think, a necessary condition is that the consumption lifestyle, as we know it in the West, has to change and perhaps has to reduce. What is India's perspective on this changes required to consumer lifestyles?
I think, thank you for raising that subject. I think it's important to understand that the climate change objectives, achieving them, energy transition goals, achieving them, cannot by itself happen unless the consumption patterns are also are addressed. So that is what our Prime Minister said, the lifestyle for environment. Why is it so important today? Because you cannot expect the climate change goals and objectives to be achieved in a manner that's expected to be achieved without addressing the consumption patterns. I think, which is again the Europeans and the developed countries talk about circular economy. It is the same thing. Today, what we are advocating, life in a way, is actually circular economy, and we have to understand these are all are integrated issues, and we have to address climate change in this context of circular economy, life, energy transition, technology, financing, justice. So all these are interlinked in a way. So I think we are trying to, what India is trying to do during its presidency is we are trying to put the perspective in its right place. That it has to be a holistic approach. It cannot be a segmented approach.
So
Yeah.
India's position in G20 on climate is I mean it's using this for other climate negotiation platforms like the IPCC or something. Is G20 the forum for India to voice its because there's COP27 or COP30 which is coming up.
Again, I'll come back to the same, the emphasis that I made for the G20 cannot hijack the agenda of other multilateral institutions or other track. Now, what happens is it's a broad understanding that member countries arrive at, but what happens in the COP negotiations are more detailing that goes into it. So I think you cannot say, this is different from that is different. But what is happening is G20 largely brings in that angle. The negotiations in COP are very important.
Okay. So thank you. So, by the way, for the people in the press, one headline for tomorrow is from Mr. Ravi is G20 cannot hijack the agenda of other multilaterals. I'm not trying to get him into trouble. What he said is G20 can strengthen the agendas that are there on the other multilaterals. You know, in fact, I was going to ask you, but I think we are running out of time because we want to invite the other panelists. That G20 doesn't have a permanent secretariat. Is that a handicap or it's okay because there's so many others who don't have?
I think it's again for the members to decide whether they want a secretariat or not. But you have various models in the world today. For example, BRICS doesn't have a secretariat of its own. There are countries which have member groups which have secretariat. It's again depending on whether it's the utility value of having a secretariat. But I think the members will have to understand again whether creating a secretariat is going to get more inertia into it or more dynamism into it.
Thus spake a bureaucrat. No, you're right. So actually, BRICS doesn't have a secretariat. In fact, the Quad doesn't have a secretariat, and India is part of. So my last question I mean, I think this conversation is very interesting, and I would have liked to put Mr. Ravi more into trouble, but we need to wrap up. But one question I want to ask you is that India is part of so many of these groupings. You know, Quad is an example, BRICS is an example. IPSA is an example, and we're going to have the members from IPSA coming up. The Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So, is there any inconsistency? I mean, do you guys run into? I know you're a diplomat, so you may answer this diplomatically. But do we run into any problems where in this forum we are taking this position X, in that forum we are taking a position Y, and X and Y are contradictory? Does that happen?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ajit. But first of all, why India is in so many forums? I think first we have to understand that. Why India is in so many forums, Quad, G20, IPSA, BRICS, and SCO, then so many other groupings. But I think it's very important that that the rise of India, which is very benign, calls for being part of those groupings, because the world is dynamically changing and there are lots of issues being discussed in different forums. And the India as a voice of the South, voice of the global South, and I think India being there helpful to articulate the voice and the concerns of the global South. But I think it's not that we are taking different positions in different groupings, but I think the internal consultations within the government is very robust. So we generally tend to maintain certain common positions which are cutting across all the groups pretty much stable.
Okay,
way.
thanks. So, I mean, this is a very interesting conversation, and we are going to take questions together at the end. I'm sure many people will have questions for Mr. Ravi, but we are going to now have the other panel join us, and therefore, in fact, one of his concluding sentences was about the interest of the global South. So, actually, the next the sort of continuing session is on the interest of the global South. So, I'll hand it over back to Shilpa, and then maybe we can get the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anade, and thank you, Mr. Ravi, for that very substantive foundation you've provided. And building on from this discussion, we now move into our next session on how the Global South will shape the G20 agenda. Joining the chair, Dr. Ajit Ranade and Mr. Damu Ravi, are His Excellency Mr. João de Mendonça Lima Neto, Consul General of Brazil in Mumbai, and Her Excellency Ms. Andrea Kuhn, Consul General of South Africa in Mumbai. Greetings to you both, and I now invite your excellencies to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilpa.
Over
Thank you for joining us, Ambassador Mendonça and Ambassador Andrea. So, I would like to kick off by asking Ambassador Mendonça about, we heard Mr. Ravi talk about the interests of the global South. G20 presidency before India was with Indonesia, and this year it's with India, and next year it's going to be with Brazil. So it's a great opportunity where the members of the South are passing the baton from one to another. And this is an opportunity for really pushing the fact that the interests of the global South need to be articulated, need to be pushed. I want to again reiterate what he said. G20, the origins go back to G7 perhaps. And the first, sort of strong action happened in the wake of the financial crisis, which some people call it the global financial crisis, but it's really the crisis of New York and Washington and London. And even today, there are a lot of issues on financial cooperation and base erosion in tax havens and so on. The interests of the developing countries, the interests of the global South, are not adequately represented, and G20 is an opportunity because presidency is now going from India to Brazil. What is your perspective on this?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ajit. Good afternoon to you all. Let me put it in a short terms. We are living in a very golden moment between us countries. We had Indonesia in G20 presidency, now India, next year Brazil, with South Africa, and then we go further. 2025, Brazil will preside BRICS. And finally, a little bit further down, we have COP30, and Brazil has already proposed a city that is in the mouth of the Amazon River to be our showcase. So anyhow, so this will have a long period where we will have a chance to have a strong voice. Well, more than that, perhaps thinking back of what has been happening in Brazil. Brazil historically has been very active in the international scene. Over the last 4 years, in fact, no, we closed ourselves in, we disengaged, abandoned our friends. We became a very much of a closed country, not looking at the problems. Up until now in January, when a new president comes along, who has been our president before, Lula.
In fact, did not Mr. Lula, wasn't he the main driving force behind IPSA?
No, exactly. That was one of our priorities then, and is now our priority again, is the dialogue with African countries. Our priorities, G20, since we are in this troika, is also one of our priorities. And we believed that between us, we can have a voice which is wider than the very much closed G7 type voice.
So Brazil will strongly support this move to bring developing country issues and the global South agenda on the G20 table. right?
Definitely, that's our main point.
So I want to before going to Ms. Andrea, I want to ask Mr. Ravi about this because it looks like this movement is going towards whether I should call it the back to non-aligned movement. I know that's not a very popular usage today, but this solidarity with the global South. What is India's perspective on this? Brazil is very much enthused. India also wants to take the lead. We'll ask South Africa as well. But this moving, you also mentioned global South. Is this India trying to be a leader or one of the leaders of ex-colonial powers? I mean, how to understand this? I'm just trying to be deliberately provocative.
No, thank you, Ajit. But I think there are a couple of issues which I think are taking advantage of both the ambassador from Brazil and from South Africa. I think IPSA, if I have to mention something about IPSA, it's been an extraordinarily exemplary cooperation of the Global South, actually. So a lot has happened within IPSA quietly. We have not made advertisement or we've not made announcement what went to. IPSA has a fund which actually have done several projects, high impact community level projects in various parts of the world. And that's been very, very successful. So very quietly it has done without making any noise, but now time has come for us to enhance that cooperation. Now coming to your particular subject of the Global South.
Yeah, global South, push.
Yeah. So I think we need to also recognize the fact that it is not something new. Now, India has always been with developing countries, the Global South, from very long time. Sometimes it predates even our independence, that kind of commitment that we had for the Global South. Then came the 1964 when we did the capacity building in small doses, but that enhanced quite significantly today. About 500,000 experts around in the Global South have been trained by Indian institutions. That's a significant contribution. Again, you still look at the infrastructure projects that we do there, either in the grants form or the lines of credit form. What is the philosophy behind it? It is a recipient country which determines what they want. We are never prescriptive. We never set the guidelines under which this assistance can be provided. I think that's been very fairly clear in the way we handle the Global South issues and concerns. And again, if you look at in the multilateral institutions, plurilateral institutions, either it's WTO, the ambassador, yes, Deepak is there, he would know that we always championed the developing countries' interests in the multilateral institutions. So this is nothing new. What is now, why this emphasis happening in the voice of the Global South now? Because we are taking advantage of India's presidency of the G20, precisely for the reason that we need to pitch the voices of the Global South through the G20 process so that when the agenda setting happens broadly across the world, then you have the issues and concerns of the Global South adequately getting captured. That's the reason why we want to take this forward.
So I think that's exactly so. This confluence of Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa hopefully will give it momentum. I want to come to, by the way, this IPSA is India, Brazil, South Africa alliance, which I think President Lula then was a very big force behind it. Indeed is a very quiet, yes, sorry, you were saying something.
I just want to remind you, when I was ambassador in Vietnam, the three ambassadors, India, South Africa, and myself, we proposed to the fund a project, small project in Vietnam that went very well. And it was important for Vietnam because it was to learn to grow seeds again. Vietnam had become the second biggest producer of rice in the world, but had no seeds. So it made sense. And Sorry, take your time.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to mention that you were an ambassador to Vietnam, and one of the many and quiet successes of IPSA was such useful use of the funds. In fact, I'm tempted to now examine this EPSA fund, whether our institute can apply for some funding from there. But that's in a lighter vein. But Ms. Andrea, uh, we were earlier in the conversation, if you remember, I mentioned the fact that Africa, which is 54 countries and 1.4 billion people, with per capita income as much as India or probably higher, something similar, I don't know, something. And it doesn't have adequate representation. So do you think, I mean, what is, you're going to be handling the presidency sometime later. What is your perspective on how we can have greater representation for Africa?
Thank you very much. I have to thank the PIC for the invitation. It's really an honor for me to be part of this esteemed panel. I do represent my High Commissioner in Delhi, so I do hope that I represent him well. I also have to inform him that you've promoted me to ambassador, so next time you should take note of that.
Well, I mean, I'm just anticipating.
No. I'm also very much aware of the fact that I'm the only participant from Africa in the whole dialogue. So I do take that responsibility on my shoulders and do hope that I can put across the views of Africa, which, as you said, is 1.4 billion people. If you take the African continent in its totality, it would be the eighth largest economy in the world. And I think, these are facts that the world forget. Um, just to mention also on this moment in time and why we pay so much attention on the Global South. Of course, it's an opportune moment where the countries of the Global South, the leadership of the Global South, will take over consecutively the leadership of the G20. But there are also other forums, and you've mentioned IPSA, and today, actually, Brazil takes over to be the leader of IPSA. And as we are very excited, because as you mentioned, President Lula was one of the founding members, and it was in Brazil that IPSA was founded in 2003. So we really look forward also to the revitalization of the IPSA and its objectives. Of course, South Africa, since the 1st of January this year, we are the chair of BRICS, which is also a formation that has been very active. And then, of course, we look forward to take over the G20 membership or chairship in 2025. Through all these forums that we participate, if it is through G20, if it's in BRICS, if it's in IPSA, if it is in the United Nations formation, we always promote that when we are the only member, like in G20 or in IPSA and BRICS, we do so to advance the interest of Africa. Yes, we are there as a country on our own, but we very much carry with us the interest of the African continent, being mindful that Africa is excluded from a majority of these international multipolar institutions in the world. So yes, there's a discussion, Africa is excluded, we should look at growing Africa's interest. And I think there's different discussions that we must also take note of. It's not only that there should be more African members, but what South Africa has been calling for is for the African Union to become a permanent member. So you have at the moment 19 countries, plus the EU, and South Africa is saying add the African Union to that forum. Yes, there are countries that have given us vocal support. One of them is President Biden at the Africa Leadership Summit in December. He very vocally pronounced his support for African Union to become a member of G20. We also saw President Macron from France, who's also committed and stated he supports this. We saw Japan giving also their support. Indonesia has given their support. And there's been positive voices from EU member states as well. So there's growing support for this notion that you should include the African Union as part of the G20. And as much as we call for the reform of international organizations and the Bretton Woods institutions, because we say we live in a changed world, it's no longer 1945. Just as much G20, it's no longer what it used to be in 2008. So we talk about contemporary challenges of the day, and I think that is how we should also perceive going forward now.
Thank you, Ms. Andrea. In fact, Mr. Ravi, please take notes. She has told you how to drive the consensus. We discussed how to convince the G20 to make African Union. If European Union can be a member, surely African Union can be a member. It is European Union is 27 countries. The African Union would be 54 countries. So surely it becomes more representative. And she has told you, some game plan how to drive that consensus. I want to also make a big plug for BRICS, and you're saying your BRICS presidency. I didn't realize that India is currently the president of IPSA as well, right? So India is holding presidency of IPSA as well as G20, and then it's going to be handed over to Brazil. And it's quite a ironic thing, or I guess historic, what should I call, a great fortune that Mr. Lula, who was president when the IPSA was formed, it's coming around a big circle. But BRICS, by the way, and it used to be BRIC, Ms. Andre, it used to be BRIC, it became BRICS. It was formed by a paper written by an economist who just wrote a paper and they were thinking what acronym should it be CRIB, IBRC? Let's call it BRIC. And it's testimony to the brand that even 21 years later, it's actually not only become entrenched as a brand, but there are BRICS summits and BRICS organizations. You don't think that economists can't create a brand. So anyway, so BRICS, I just want to dwell before we come to Brazil, that BRICS like IPSA is 3 different countries, 3 different continents, 3 different cultures, completely different. Brazil, South Africa, and India. Similarly, BRICS, some people say, is very different. It's a combination of very different countries and very, very different domestic characteristics. But it has survived. So what can you just comment on that? What drives its longevity and sustainability, and the fact it is doing well? Now we have a BRICS bank as well. What is the secret to its longevity?
Yes, BRICS has survived. It was started in 2009, as you mentioned, and then South Africa became a member in 2010, and the first summit we attended was in 2011, the summit in China. Through the BRICS chairship, we have found that it is a mechanism for us to advance the issues of the developing world also into other platforms. So we, as South Africa, we value our BRICS membership. The BRICS summit this year will be held in South Africa in August under the theme BRICS and Africa Partnership for Mutually Accelerated Growth, Sustainable Development and Inclusive Multilateralism. And it's also through this theme that we wish to provide leadership and momentum towards global growth, sustainable development, and the inclusion of the global south in the world system. So it's very much in terms of our priorities and the values that we also put forward when we participate in the G20, it's fairly much aligned to that.
But I just want to ask you that do you find handling these 5 members or 4 members, apart from South Africa, they are so different like chalk and cheese? And even then they manage to come together, and you just described what kind of agenda they're pursuing. There's a lesson for it for G20. I'm just curious. I know that this is a big separate topic, but you're now BRICS presidency. That's why I'm saying. So you must be handling it from Pretoria.
Yes.
You have China, you have India, you have Brazil. So
yeah. Of course, BRICS, when it started, very much, the agenda was much more limited to what it's expanded to. You now see BRICS that has committees and ministerial meetings in every possible theme and in sector. Yes, and of course, there are some overlap and there are some issues, just as you mentioned, with the G20 agenda, that you shouldn't let the agendas of these multilateral bodies impede on other multilateral bodies. So, but if you look at the declarations of the BRICS summits, it speaks very specifically about the issues of the developing world. It speaks about issues of sovereignty. It speaks about issues of non-alignment. It speaks about also reform of international institutions. So there's a like-mindedness that, yes, these countries also need a voice where they are excluded in other multilateral bodies.
Okay. So let me ask Mr. Ravi. See, BRICS, BRICS are all members of G20, right? So they can kind of form a mini club, gang up and try to drive the consensus regarding membership of AU, as well as strengthening the agenda for the Global South. Is that a possibility?
Thank you, Ajit. For a very long time within the G20, there used to be a BRICS coordinated positions. So it on for example trade issues, investment issues. There used to be a well articulated position within the G20, and it continued for a very long time. But you are right. You know, the BRICS members are very divergent group of members. So then you have the ambition levels are very different levels of ambitions. Sometimes it's difficult to find alignment in their positions and find convergence in the
Within
positions.
BRICS.
Sometimes, because of the levels of ambitions being so different. But I think we should understand that BRICS has achieved quite significantly since the time it was formed. Today, the NDB bank is
New
become
development
so,
bank, yeah.
new development bank is become so significant in executing funding projects around the world, and many countries are now tapping into NDB resources for those kind of projects. It's come a long way, which is why today there is a lot of interest for countries to become members of the BRICS. So they see true value in it. But in my view, I don't think we should aim for convergence on every issue. I think the dialoguing itself is success. Within BRICS, there are many tracks on which there are a lot of activities going on. It's ongoing. For example, science and technology, business forums, the MSME, trade facilitation. So a lot is already happening within the BRICS. But sometimes it might be slow because of the levels of ambitions being different, but it is moving. So I think we're quite happy
Ambassador
on that.
Mendonça, on BRICS, the role of the BRICS, I heard Mr. Ravi say that sometimes there's BRICS coordination which helps in your G20 agenda. So
No, I
what's the
think
experience
that
of Brazil?
I wanted to point out to something that you already have, so I really have very little to add. I just want to emphasize the importance of the bank or our fund. The BRICS Bank is been funding projects all over the world. And this we can bring to the G20 and help G20 have a more effective, at least in the global dialogue, a more positive voice.
So when you look at your experience in BRICS and your experience in G20, BRICS by definition is a sort of a developing country organization. What is your experience in terms of pushing the agenda for the developing country concerns? What is Brazil's experience?
Well, I'll be very frank with you. I know very little about the BRICS, so, because I haven't been working with this for a long time. So I prefer not to answer this.
No, but you know, for example, you mentioned the bank. I mean,
Yes.
the BRICS Bank was a very big achievement, I would say, where member
Yes.
countries agreed to contribute to the seed funding, and now they are evaluating funding proposals in a neutral, objective, unbiased way in different countries. So this is something to learn because this consensus has come in BRICS. Surely G20. Do you anticipate that G20 can also take up such funding?
I wanted to perhaps add, we have mentioned the diversity of points of view within BRICS, but at the same time, from the Brazilian point of view, we have a common voice. We have excellent relations with all the countries of BRICS. We have a permanent dialogue with them. So it's not as complicated as that.
Can you give an example where something you would like to bring to the G20 table, which is currently not on the table?
That's
From Brazil's perspective. maybe.
well, let me put it this way. What will be our priorities from next year when we take over? I have a list. Sustainable development is one of the questions. Energy, climate, infrastructure development. These are topics that are extremely important. We believe we will focus on from next year, which obviously already being discussed.
In fact, you mentioned that the COP conference, which Brazil will host, will be in a place called Belém,
Yes.
which is in the Amazon forest.
That's right.
So that exactly. So actually, when you say sustainable development on energy, infrastructure, these are very much issues of concern to developing countries.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes.
And if you go back to G20 or G7, It used to be much more about financial coordination or ensuring that there are no, the panic behavior of financial markets. It was more about financial stability. Is that not correct, Mr. Ravi? About the earlier concerns were more about global financial flows and not so much about infrastructure and sustainable development in G20. Yeah.
Yeah, so Ajit, if you look at the 21st century issues for the world at large, and in particular for developing countries, in the days to come, there will be a lot of attention on food security. I think the geopolitical tensions have clearly indicated that it's so important for all of us to be guarded on securing food for people. Um, and the disruption in the food supply chains have put large parts of humanity in different regions at risk. I think that will be one issue where G20 will take it up very strongly. I think Prime Minister's leadership, we already talked about millets as an alternate crop which can come in to help in this filling the gap in the food security. There's a lot of work needs to be done in that front. Energy transition is another thing because a lot of countries are still fossil fuel dependent. So if they have to also meet the climate change goals, then the transition has to be smooth and spread over a period of time, not immediate. I think one has to recognize this. And the way to build it within the G20 is for everyone else to be sensitive to the ability of developing countries and the least developed countries to meet that benchmarks in a manner that is possible for them. The second thing is, again, the debt issues. I think the financial crisis will continue to be a problem. In the next 3 years, the world will likely to go into a recession because of the way things are. Geopolitical tensions contributing significantly to it. But I think the debt issues for many developing countries, one priority item
So
for
that means
G20.
how to help developing countries deal with the high mountain of debt. Is that what is?
Yeah, so I think few ideas are already being discussed there. One is the restructuring part. I think they have to be innovative in the way you address the hard currency crisis. One of which is the UPI. The Prime Minister has mentioned that the digital tools that can be used for amongst countries to do trading, to do business on the through these digital platforms, and be innovative in the way you do your business, not necessarily in hard currency, perhaps it could be national currency. I think those ideas would need to be brainstormed within the G20. You have to overcome this immediate crisis. And mind you, a large number of developing countries, not part of these geopolitical tensions, but they are affected most. And their ability to handle this crisis is very, very difficult. So we'll have to come out with innovative solutions there. I think India is, that way, has got a very good example in the digital architecture, how it can bring in efficiency in the financial transactions can be smoother. I'm not saying that everyone should replicate Indian model, but I think it's worth discussing those models and see to what extent they can be incorporated.
In fact, let's spend a few minutes on this one specific item, which is financial transactions across countries. And I know that, of course, India is now leading because of the UPI, Unified Payment Interface, which is, I believe, India now accounts for 40% of the transactions of the world. And it is very inclusive. It's not just, it's not just low cost, but it's very inclusive because even the lowest income people from the lowest income sections are able to utilize this low cost. But I know that in Africa also, actually, we forget that the M-Pesa, the mobile payment revolution, actually began in Africa. Mr. Andrea, what is how do you see this, at least G20 being utilized as a forum to discuss cross-country transactions, payment? Actually, GPI is a payment mechanism. It doesn't address debt reduction, but Africa, what do you see the prospects for cross-country transactions, digital transactions?
One of South Africa's priorities in the G20 is specifically the issues that was identified by India on digital transformation, which of course will in the end also include payments across continents. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the M-Pesa, because I think it's a fact that's forgotten, that the first country to do contactless payments that introduced it to the world was Kenya. So I think this is the important point that we also make, why Africa should have a voice and should be at the table, because they also bring expertise and technical capabilities. I think there's a perception that, when you include Africa, it's a benevolent action. It's not. We should remember that this is not a charity. The world needs Africa. We have many of the vital resources that's needed also for the just transition in energy process that's going on. Whatever Africa decides in terms of its climate change actions will have an impact on the rest of the world. It was the African Union that was the country that got the first ships with the food grain to leave the ports and block that challenge that we had last year. So it's to take Africa out of this, or give Africa only one seat at the table, I think is problematic. Africa has a lot of expertise. We're developing further expertise as we've launched the African Continental Free Trade Area on the 1st of January 2021. So within the continent, as we are lifting trade barriers and tariffs, there's also now the development of these contactless apps and digital payments between.
What is your experience within Africa about these cross-border payments using contactless or app-based or mobile-based payments?
It's growing. There is a system that is in place in East and Central Africa that will
How many countries are involved?
If I give you the figure, I will have to correct.
In the sense, it's more than South Africa.
Yes, right? No. This is regional. This is regionals that I'm talking about. So there are already these digital payment systems that are in place, because if you remember, Africa has the regional economic blocks. So within regional economic blocks, there's economic integration taking place. And within the economic integration, part of that is also to have these digital payment systems. So you already have regional economic blocks that have merged with each other, that have formed bigger free trade areas as a building block to the continental free trade area.
In fact, it's a fantastic revolution. I mean, we have not even begun, I think, Ambassador Mendonça. Even as we speak today, you must have heard, I hope you get a chance to use UPI when you're in India, but you live in Mumbai, so you probably do. I'm told that in the suburban railway, you can buy your ticket now on your WhatsApp, on your mobile, and you get a QR code, and you just go and then just scan the QR code before entering the station. So it's completely contactless. So I believe in Brazil also you've actually made some progress on this international digital transactions, especially in Mercosur. Is there something you can?
At the moment, we already developed a similar system as UPI.
Seamless
in India.
system, yeah.
We're studying it. It's the PIX, we call it. Since I left Brazil 6 years ago, it didn't exist yet. So I'm not quite sure how it works. Perhaps our ambassador, Karamuru, could give us some point.
No, but this is also an initiative which was taken at the Mercosur level, right?
Yes.
Yes. So just like Sandria mentioned that there's a regional union, sort of cooperation on these digital payments. It's actually also functioning at a smaller level in Mercosur.
It's been implemented, that's the point. I think that it will be useful for all of us. It will make transactions so much cheaper.
So UPI payments, I'm told, are now, yesterday there was a mention made of that you can transact with Singapore. But
yes.
I believe people are already using UPI-based transfers in East Asian countries. So there's already usage. I don't know whether the government knows about it or not, but it seems to be happening. We have a person from the head of technology of a software company. He might tell us. But I want to come. One topic which Mr. Ravi mentioned is about debt, the problems of debt of developing countries, the mounting debt. And one of the big issue here is the role of hard currency, which is the dollar, the almighty dollar, as they call it, the hegemony of the dollar. There's only one country in the world which can forgive its own debt by printing more notes, and that is the USA. Because it's their currency, it's their dollar. In fact, very famously, the Secretary of Treasury of the United States back in 1973 or 74 said, the dollar is our currency, but your problem. So, do you see any developing country initiative to get away from the almighty dollar, or are we stuck with it?
I think we stuck with it. But I remember quite a long time ago uh, an initiative that we had in the Ministry of Finance. While I was working there, our ambassador, Karamuro, has also followed up on this, is debt restructuring, debt negotiations. At that time, we joined Latin American countries that were heavily indebted to be able to negotiate with a little bit more force with American banks. So we had Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil. I'm not quite sure if Argentina were, probably it was. We used to meet regularly to decide on strategy, on how to negotiate. And it worked very well.
How to negotiate with American banks?
That's right, yes. Because I remember through this pressure, or the same type of position, we were able to negotiate with more ease. And I think that's the way forward. It's the countries of the South to meet on that subject.
No, but the heavy burden of having a dollar debt is, if you want an example from right now, our neighboring country, Pakistan, their debt has gone up by 2,000%. Of course, a lot of it is domestic, but because their currency has slipped from whatever it used to be 100 and now it is 300. So the currency depreciation and the relationship with the dollar is a big factor in debt. And no, I don't know whether when you said debt renegotiation or debt problem of debt restructuring, nobody talks about debt forgiveness. I don't think that's so. Mr. Ravi, I mean, or
No, I just want to mention, before that was contracted in dollars, so payable in dollar. Nowadays we have other options. China has become a big player, and the debt is in a different currency.
So, is there a prospect for a developing country approach to departure from dollar dependency, Mr. Ravi?
I mean, no one can say conclusively when, but I think it's important to keep talking about it and discussing about it. Let us look at the real problems of the developing countries. Today, the servicing of debt itself is a mounting task, actually. It goes in billions of dollars. I think for developing countries, I was just looking at the statistics. In a year, it's about close to anywhere between 50 to 100 billion dollars. It's just the servicing of the debt. So it's really it's a large sum for countries which are low-income countries, LDC countries. Now, how do they generate the hard currency to pay back? So, only thing is if they're vibrantly trading. Now, and how is it possible for them to vibrantly trading when the global trade architecture is loaded against them? That we have to understand that the dynamics are not in their favor. So how do you address this? That's what I was saying. Initially I said we have to be innovative in addressing this problem. I think G20 has already, in two presidencies ago, had talked about debt restructuring issue. I think currently they're also talking about under the Common Framework Program of the restructuring. But I'm not sure forgiveness of debt is going to be that easy, because then it will be a ripple effect, and many countries will ask for it, and that would be billions of dollars, or if not trillions of dollars. So I don't think that they will come there. But what countries can do is, let's say if hard currency is a shortage, then would countries then can think in terms of doing in their own national currency? So then, you stitch around the rules and the framework around that, how you can smoothly do it. In the same way, the UPI actually doesn't require a hard currency element in it.
But
So,
UPI is about transactions, not about debt relief.
No, no, I'm talking about in the financial world.
Yeah.
You know, these are all our instruments that you need to use increasingly to overcome the dependency on the hard currency.
Of course, UPA is now breaking the monopoly of mechanisms like SWIFT or Visa, Mastercard. So I think the discussion is very interesting, and I wanted to bring in one element of geopolitics and how is G20 dealing with the fact that one of its members is kind of has behaved like a rogue and invaded another country. But I'm not going to ask this question to my panel. Maybe before we want to take questions from the audience. But I want to ask South Africa because when we talk about debt and so on, and I believe South Africa is one of a unique country where your dependence on foreign flows to fund your deficit is very high, and yet year after year, decade after decade, South Africa is very happy to take dollar debt. Your bonds are floated in dollars, and it seems to be fine. So what's the secret?
No, thank you. Indebtedness is one of our priorities raising at the G20. So just say that it is a responsibility that we also feel on behalf of the developing countries, specifically Africa, that we should raise. We see the impact, the detrimental impact of highly indebtedness and how it impacts on the growth story of countries. I also just want to mention that the African Union Summit concluded last week, and the Secretary General of the United Nations participated, and in his speech, he made some very valid points when we talk about issues of debt. First of all, he made the comment that the financial international institutions are failing the developing world, and that the rules is written in such a way that there's limited access, and if there is access, the interests that are charged are just extortionate. So he called for a new Bretton Woods moment, that was his speech, where you put the developing world at the heart of financial institutions, and also calling for the reform of not only the Bretton Woods institutions, but also institutions like the Security Council. So, as we are approaching 2030, where we have to meet the SDG goals, until we address these issues, we will not meet as a global world the SDG objectives. And unless we all achieve it, it serves no purpose. And that is also the frame of, what we are all saying, that we can't leave anybody behind. You mentioned specifically South Africa. It is only recently that we started taking out IMF loans again. There was for a long period that we were committed not to go that route. So it is.
Because you depend on private flows, foreign
Yes,
flows. They
yes.
were private investors are happy to invest in.
Yes. But we do see also that with the global changes and the shocks that we've experienced, that investment flows to the country has shrunk. There was a presidential drive to increase investment flows into the country, where the president launched a 5-year plan and hosts every year a big international investment conference. The next edition of that will be on the 13th of April in South Africa, where he already announced he will renew the call for this investment program. We just, the budget of South Africa was read 2 days ago. And the good news for us is that in terms of the revenue that is collected, it still is more than what government spending is, which also...
So you have a fiscal surplus.
We still have to pay off lots of debt to the IMF loans that we've taken. But in terms of our domestic situation, because of we have a highly developed and advanced financial institutions in the country, and that's what we benefit from. And I just want to make a comment also about your question about moving away from the dollar. I mean, we mentioned the new development bank, the BRICS Bank. The BRICS Bank, you loan in your own currency, and the contingency reserve fund is also in your own currency. So that is part of what the BRICS success story is trying to, the dependency of the dollar, to move away from that. We see that more countries are joining the BRICS Bank, UAE, Uruguay. So it is expanding its membership because of the benefits that other developing countries have seen in the BRICS Bank as well.
Thank you. Thanks for mentioning that. The BRICS Bank, debt arrangements are different. But I do note your comment of when you quoted the Secretary General that the financial institutions are failing the developing countries. And of course, the debt is a huge problem. The world debt to GDP ratio is nearly 350 or 400%. So it's not very clear how how we are going to get out of this debt mountain. But I think we have to stop here because we need some time to take questions. I will invite the participants here to pose their questions, and the mic will come to you. Please be brief if you can and specific. Yeah, Mr. Sudanva. Maybe we will collect three questions and then take questions in bunches of three.
Can we think of an initiative or a set of ideas to connect the SMEs from India with the blocs around the world, whether it is G20, Africa?
Okay. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think another hand here. Sorry, this one here. Yeah. Mr. Deepak.
Thank you for a very valuable discussion. India's efforts to put concerns of the global south on the G20 table are commendable indeed, because it will hopefully bring concerns like food security and mounting debt to the table. But we should not forget that G20 is a rich boys club and has traditionally pushed the developed country agenda. Developing country concerns are articulated only by a few in this forum. So as long as G20 remained a talking shop only, we were protected. But I hope that it does not get overactive and starts imposing the developed country agenda on multilateral institutions like the WTO and UNFCCC. So my question is, how can India as G20 chair prevent this from happening?
Okay.
And will our role as hosts and consequent concerns of having a successful summit outcome weaken our traditional resolve of blocking issues that have been against the interests of the global south?
I'm assuming that question is for all the three panelists. Yeah. The lady at the back, please.
Thank you for the valuable discussion. So I believe cryptocurrencies are here to stay, and it's like a roaring lion, and which is very, very unregulated. But I am sure G20 has its own view, and probably a collective effort is needed. So I just wanted to understand whether G20 had its own views, or are there some discussions which will happen around regulations of these cryptocurrencies?
Okay.
Thank you.
So, panelists, there are three questions. The first question was, how do we ensure that the SMEs, small and medium enterprises, tiny, small companies across G20 get connected with each other, because that's where most of the employment and value addition and exports happen. Second question was that how do you ensure that the rich boys agenda doesn't overwhelm the developing countries agenda, and what role can specifically India play? So maybe Mr. Ravi can take that. And the third question is this cryptocurrencies, the blockchain-based currencies. Is there any G20 view about regulation of these currencies? So whoever wants to jump in, Mr. Ravi, can you take the second question?
Yeah.
About how to, or even Mr. Ambassador Mendonça, how do we ensure that the rich boys club do not dominate the G20 agenda? Rich boys and women, I should say.
So, I think Ambassador J.S. Deepak is so knowledgeable on all these issues. So I think question coming from him is indeed very loaded about G20's its own activism, I think, in the way. So the concern from you, sir, I think mostly is while G20 is okay to have a dialogue, but it should not be overactive and take over the agenda. And that's what I started off initially also, that the agenda setting, the global agendas are now, discourse is moving into G20. But the one thing that is real in G20 is that there are no decisions taken that is binding on any member country or globally. What happens here is a broad discussions, broad convergence, then go into the dialogue of the specific institutions, like the COP Conference of Parties. Now, within that, they again go into minute details about funding, about technology transfers. So is the trade issues. You need to have to revitalize WTO to set the agenda on the broad discussions that take place within G20. Now, what India can do, I don't think India alone can do anything about it, because we have to see how the trends are and building the narrative within G20. So being inside the G20 and build the narrative in the interest of developing countries should be our objective.
But surely, as G20 president, it can be sensitive to this and perhaps block certain attempts to overwhelm the agenda with only rich country issues.
Well, I think India alone blocking may not be the right approach. I think there should be a certain critical number game here to prevent any development that may be adversarial for developing countries. But I think we should see how we can manage to move forward without upsetting the agenda, because you will not know the consequences of particular decision, whether it's going to be extremely bad or good. But we have to walk the talk and see to what extent we are able to bring in the developing countries' agenda should be our goal.
Amanda Mendonça, you have a view on this and the other questions as well.
It's not exactly a view, I already mentioned. I think we're living a very important moment, a golden moment in IPSA within the G20, meaning Indonesia, Brazil, Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and then we go along with BRICS. Within that moment, our dialogue has to be very close. Our presidency will not decide anything, but we can steer, and I think that's the point that is important. I already mentioned some of the...
Do you at least agree that this is an important issue? That
No, certainly. Yes, I do agree. And I already mentioned some of the priorities that we will have within our presidency.
Would you like to address the other question, which was about how to connect
SMEs?
the small businesses across different countries?
Well, in part. But I think, let me speak about my own role as Consul General and as a diplomat, is to know well the country. I just been to Bangalore and I was extremely surprised by what I saw, the number of the companies that are so in science, technology, innovation. They are first class. And the problem is, they know very little about Brazil. That in our dialogue we had, I found that out. And Brazil obviously doesn't have it. So it's up to me, up to a certain extent, inform the Brazilian authority, Brazilian different agencies about the existence of these groups and the need to come and visit. And so as to promote exactly the cooperation or partnership between SMEs. So the first thing that I think is important is, in fact, knowledge. And this, obviously, we can also do within the G20.
You know, in the age of e-commerce and platforms and Amazon, I think it should be possible to enable contact between SMEs of different countries. That it's no longer the case that you need to have contacts in the embassy or the consul general's office, and you need to go through large industry chambers. Surely some platform, maybe the government can support.
But just something, a small mention here. Of course, you have these big platforms, Amazon and whatever, but they're taking over the internet. They're not necessarily in favor or in our favor. We have, again, to have a dialogue on this and to promote this digital.
Yeah, you're right. You don't depend on Amazon, but at least the platforms can be utilized where maybe government can play an enabling role. But let me come to Ms. Andrea. Do you have any views on either, as you said, making sure that the rich boys don't dominate, and also the cross-border regulation of cryptocurrencies?
Thank you. On the issue of SMMEs, or MSMEs as you call them in India, this is extremely important for South Africa and for the rest of the African continent. It's the major supplier of jobs creation on the continent and in South Africa. In South Africa, it's estimated anything 65% plus is small business. We therefore also created a ministry for small business development in South Africa, where we drive the agenda to promote and support. And we've included in this ministry also women youth and disabled people. So we promote and support the sector of our economy. And the same goes
Do you
to,
connect them to customers overseas, like in India, let's say, or?
yes, yes, we do. I can, since as my friend Joe spoke about our job in what we do actually, I can assure you that half of my time I spend promoting small business in Mumbai and in Maharashtra. And Dr. Salunki, who's the chair of the SME Chamber in
Yes.
Mumbai, is a
Yeah.
very good friend of mine. And we are also organizing, exchanging delegations, and also concluding a MOU. So it is extremely important. I think, yes, it's difficult to say what the G20 should do, because that would depend on what the trade ministers or the finance ministers, what's on their agenda. But I think definitely on a country to country level, that is very active. and
That's
that
true.
happens.
That's an issue which is common to all developing countries. That the small and medium and enterprises, they are the ones who bear the greatest burden of employment creation, of industrial output, but yet they are always very vulnerable. And in terms of any comment on the question the lady asked about cryptocurrencies cross border.
I'm going to pass on that one, because South Africa's cryptocurrency economy is not that developed. I know there are efforts by the Indian G20 presidency to take that issue forward, but yeah, I think maybe I'll pass. But to support what my colleague from Brazil said about the golden moment for four developing countries, having back-to-back the presidency of the G20. I think we should learn from the lessons of what we went through
Yes.
with the shocks with the global pandemic, which showed us if you leave a certain part of the world behind, you see the outfall. We saw with the vaccine distribution, that's an excellent example, where the African continent at some point only stood at 3% distribution, where you looked at Europe, which was almost reaching 50%. It has an impact on your economy, it has an impact on social programs, and I think this is the lessons that we want to take as the presidency is taking over the presidency, that you cannot leave out a part of the world's economy and a part of the world population.
Yes.
And that's why we support what India is doing to bring a voice to the global south, to support what the developing countries' agendas, and call for reform. I think what I really like is in the virtual summit, the Global Voice Summit that was hosted recently. Of course, South Africa didn't participate as a G20 member, but Prime Minister Modi made the comment about the 4 R's, which I think going forward as a developing country and the presidencies, these are very critical.
The four-
Respond, recognize, respect, and reform, and then how you align all those issues into your agenda. So
Thank you. That's very good. So maybe a quick word. I think we are running out of time. Mr. Ravi, you can have the last word about if you want to talk about the cryptocurrency or any other closing comment.
No, I'm sorry, I don't have an update on the cryptocurrency because I'm not privy to the discussions in the finance track, but we will get you an update at some stage. I think broadly, the way I see is G20 during India presidency is an opportunity. There are challenges around us, but I think India is well positioned to develop and articulate the interests of developing countries, the global south. I think in the days to come, as the world will face more crisis, you need India in the center stage to give direction, articulation to the voice of the south. And I think what better time than after Brazil will take over South Africa. I think we can build the momentum during these next 3 years to developing a very strong agenda for the global south. Thank you.
Thank you. I think on that note, I really have to wrap up because we are out of time. The concluding line really sums it up. This is all our panelists think this is a golden opportunity or a golden sequence, starting with Indonesia, then India, Brazil, and then South Africa. So this is a time to strengthen G20, strengthen the aspect of representation of the developing country interests, and also the agenda of interest for sustainable development. So I thank the panelists for excellent discussion, and thank you for your thoughts. And I think we'll wrap up. So thank you all. And over back to Shilpa.
Thank you very much to our chair and our panelists. I think they've given us all a lot of food for thought. And on that note, I'm going to announce a lunch break. So, but before that, may I please request our chair to hand over a small token of appreciation to our distinguished guests on behalf of PIC. Thank you.